This is the Geopolitical Update podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. The Geopolitical Update is your trusted source for timely analysis of this week's most significant global security and defense-related developments. I'm Josh Malm, and on the afternoon of May 16th, 2025, these are the main stories from around the world. In Istanbul, during the first direct talks between Ukraine and Russia in over 3 years, both sides agreed to exchange 1,000 prisoners of war. The meeting, which lasted less than 2 hours, marked a rare diplomatic contact since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022 and came amid continued fighting and unresolved disputes over territory, security guarantees, and NATO membership. To dissect the meeting and its implications for the war, we spoke with Thomas Graham, Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Also in this week's podcast, in Ottawa, newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled a new cabinet with 24 new faces and several returning ministers. In North Africa, fierce clashes erupted in Tripoli after the killing of a prominent militia leader. The violence has raised concerns of escalating instability in Libya's fragmented capital. In the Middle East, Syria is nearing the potential normalization of relations with the United States, with discussions around the lifting of some sanctions gaining momentum. And in South Asia, a temporary truce was declared this week in Kashmir after escalating violence between India and Pakistan. First, in Istanbul, Ukraine and Russia met face-to-face for the first time in over 3 years. Expectations were low and no wider deal was reached, as Russia stuck to its demands on territory in NATO while Ukraine called for a full ceasefire. To dissect the meeting and its implications for the war, we spoke with Thomas Graham, Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm wondering if you can let us know what the expectations were going into the meeting, and from your perspective, what some of the key outcomes were from today's meeting.
Well, I think the expectation should have been quite limited for a meeting like this. The Russians have been quite clear from the very beginning that they are not interested in a ceasefire absent a resolution of what they call the root causes of the conflict, and those would have to be the issues that would have to be addressed in any direct negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians. The reports coming out of Istanbul are that they talked about 3 issues. I think the ceasefire, exchange of prisoners, and a possible meeting between the 2 presidents. The only issue that they made any progress on was prisoners exchange, and they're talking about the largest prisoner exchange of the war since the war began, 1,000 on each side. Obviously, there are a lot of details that have to be worked out, but that was perhaps the most that could be accomplished in a face-to-face meeting between the Russians and the Ukrainians at this point.
Can you explain and dive a little bit deeper into what some of the key demands from both parties have been?
Well, on the Ukrainian side, they have agreed with the Trump administration's request that there be a 30-day ceasefire during which the parties could talk about peace arrangements. Now, clearly, I think what the Ukrainians are interested in any negotiations is what they would call security guarantees, something that would give them a high level of assurance that once there is a ceasefire, that the Russians would not simply use that to reconstitute their military forces and launch another attack against Ukraine. It could be within weeks, months, or years, and that requires obviously the input of the United States and Ukraine's European partners and allies, but also some agreement on the Russian part to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. When the Russians talk about root causes, what they have in mind are issues that go beyond simply Ukraine to broader questions of European security. It is the role of NATO in Europe. They clearly want a commitment and firm commitment that Ukraine will never join NATO, but they'd also like commitments from NATO that it's not going to extend further eastward into what Russia considers its sphere of influence. They also have a set of demands that are focused on domestic conditions inside Ukraine. The Russians have talked about the need to denazify Ukraine. What that is code for is regime change, a new leadership in Ukraine, but also what the Russians would call guarantees for the rights of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians inside Ukraine. So those are the 2 sort of buckets that they want resolved before they are prepared to agree to a ceasefire.
What has the Trump administration's approach been throughout the brokering of these peace talks? And what would you say has been the impact of the Trump administration's foreign policy on proceedings and on the war effort more generally?
Well, I mean, from the very beginning, the administration wanted to bring this conflict to an end. I mean, I think the president is sincere when he says that he is horrified by the loss of life, and that he would like to see the killing end. And that was the one of the main reasons for getting involved in this process. In addition, the president clearly has greater plans for U.S.-Russian relations over the long term, and believes that there's strategic advantage to building a much more constructive relationship with Russia. And the only way to get there was through a resolution of the Russia-Ukraine war. And that was another incentive for the president to be engaged. Now, what we've seen over the past 2 or 3 months is clearly that that Washington has much more leverage over the Ukrainians than it does over the Russians, and they've used that leverage to get the Ukrainians to agree, for example, to a 30-day ceasefire, absent the security guarantees that Ukraine has been looking for. The leverage with the Russians is quite a bit less. They have had many discussions. There have been certain threats that the president has uh, issued publicly from time to time about sanctions, for example, and tariffs, but not sufficient to get the Kremlin to move off its basic position that we deal with the root causes and then we have a ceasefire. Final point here is I think the administration was right in opening up relations with Russia. You're not going to be able to get to a resolution of this crisis unless you're talking directly with the Russians. The administration, I think, underestimated the difficulty of doing that. It's going to be a long haul, but it does require continued engagement by the United States if we're going to be able to move this conflict towards an enduring resolution.
Thanks, Dr. Graham. So here we sit, May 16th. It's Friday. We just had the peace talks, which we've just discussed. What do you see coming down the pike in the coming days to weeks, both on the war front and diplomatically?
Well, on the war front, you're going to see a continuation of the conflict. Aerial bombardments, both sides, continued fighting along the line of contact. The Russians, for the past several months, have been making small gains on the ground. I would imagine they will continue to do that, but there won't be any sort of strategic breakthrough that dramatically changes the course of the conflict. So pretty much the continuation of what we've seen over the past several months. The Russians are, by all accounts, planning for a major offensive this summer. We'll wait to see whether that has more success than the major offensives that they've tried to launch and the Ukrainians have tried to launch over the past 3 years. On the diplomatic front, there will be, I think, further engagement between Russia and the United States. The challenge here is to find a formula that will persuade the Russians that their concerns about the root causes will be addressed in some sort of future negotiations, even if they sign it up to a ceasefire at this point. And that's what I think the conversations with Moscow should be focused on at this point. And just we'll have to wait and see. Anybody who's expecting an early end to this conflict is going to be disappointed profoundly. It's going to take time and effort, and we're going to see the negotiations continue as the fighting on the battlefield continues. That's sort of the way these things work, and that's the way wars have unfolded historically and peace agreements have unfolded historically.
In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled a new cabinet of 28 ministers and 10 secretaries of state. Key members include Anita Anand as Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dominic LeBlanc focusing on Canada-U.S. trade, and David McGuinty as Minister of Defense. The new cabinet promises to address the ongoing U.S. trade war, with Carney also emphasizing his commitment to increasing defense spending. To discuss what the new cabinet structure and appointments could spell for Canada's national security and defense, we're joined by CDA Institute board member and former national security advisor to the Prime Minister, our very own Vincent Rigby. Vincent, it's great to have you on again. Thanks. Mark Carney, the newly elected Prime Minister, recently announced his cabinet. I'm wondering if you can discuss what you think the cabinet appointments might imply about areas of focus, and what the structure, which includes now 10 secretaries of state, might also imply about the direction the government's going in on the defense and security files.
Well, as you say, Josh, I think that, we didn't have a full-up debate around defense and foreign policy during the election campaign. It was very focused in terms of international relations on the Canada-U.S. relationship. But still, defense came up in that context, given U.S. pressure to get up to 2% of GDP spending on defense and other issues related to broader national security, border security, all those kinds of things. So I thought that the Liberal campaign was pretty clear that it wanted to make a greater commitment to national defense. They're very clear that they had a number of equipment purchases that they wanted to pursue. Prime Minister Carney has made it clear that he wants to get to 2% of GDP by 2030. So it's a pretty ambitious program. Lots of stuff needs to get done. And I think what we're hearing from Prime Minister Carney is he wants to get stuff done fast, very fast. So I think he's appointed cabinet ministers who are going to be given their marching orders and told to get moving and to proceed expeditiously. And I think in that respect, his selections in sort of the defense, foreign policy, public safety, these are ministers who I think bring a little bit of experience, at least on the defense and foreign policy side. David McGuinty, I think, is a very solid choice. A longtime MP, only recently became a cabinet minister for public safety. He's now been moved over to national defense. I think as the chair of the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians for 6 or 7 years. I worked very closely with him when I was National Security Intelligence Advisor. He has a good overall sense of the national security realm. His committee did at least 1 or 2 reports directly related to national defense, mainly on the intelligence side, but he'll have a good, solid understanding of how defense works. So it's nice to see somebody go in there with a little bit of experience, and that'll be helpful. And the same with Minister Annan on the foreign policy side. She was the defense minister, and she's got some experience on the procurement side as well, especially in the context of COVID. So she's moving over to foreign affairs. And I think that defense experience, especially on the international side, will stand her in good stead. I also think it was very interesting that they appointed a Secretary of State for defense procurement, Steve Fuhr, who's a former Air Force guy. And that's a very interesting appointment. I think it shows that the government is committed to improving defense procurement. They've already announced that they're going to establish a defense procurement agency. They want to get moving on procurement reform, and they also want to move specific capital projects, I think. So there's some good signs there, some really good signs. It's the proof's going to be in the pudding. We'll see how fast they proceed. We've seen lots of other governments come in the past who've said lots of good things about defense, and they're going to reform procurement and get moving on all this. But there's an added urgency now. In addition to a very complicated international security situation, you've now got the U.S. dimension, and so I think it will be incumbent upon the government to really move. And as I say, it seems like that's where Prime Minister Carney is.
Thanks, Vincent. Aside from the threat of Trump, which we've been talking about for many months now, what do you think are some of the immediate challenges facing the cabinet? And from your experience, what might you suggest to the incoming cabinet as well on the defense and security files?
Well, listen, I'd like to see the government set the strategic context for defense, foreign policy, national security. So much is happening in the world, so rough and tumble, so many complexities, so many nuances. As I said, a new layer added in the last 6 months with Trump, but the world was already a pretty chaotic place. We've had 2 defense strategies in the last 7-8 years, 2017, and then again the update in 2024, but we've had no national security strategy. As I've said many times before, for 20 years, we've had no foreign policy for a statement for 20 years. So I thought it was very interesting that the Liberals said during the campaign, we're going to do a foreign policy review and we're going to come up with a new national security statement. I think they need to put an urgent tag on those 2, before they start moving helter-skelter on this, that, or the other specific projects, foreign policy initiatives. Defense needs to be nestled inside a broader national security strategy, and it also needs to be nestled inside a broader foreign policy strategy. What is our foreign policy? What are we going to do on the world stage? defense does lots of stuff at home, but obviously they've still got expeditionary capability as well. So how are you going to use the Canadian armed forces overseas to support our foreign policy and to support our broader national security? So nice to see those commitments. Let's move ahead and get them done. I thought it was really great to see that the Prime Minister reestablished the National Security Council. As you know, when he first became Prime Minister, he combined the Canada-U.S. Cabinet Committee with the National Security Council. I didn't think that was a very good idea, but I understood that given the short time frame before the election, he was trying to have as slimmed down a cabinet system as possible. But reconstituting that National Security Council, I think, will be absolutely critical in forging ahead with a new national security strategy and with a foreign policy review as well. So it'd be nice to see that stuff get up and running.
In North Africa, fierce clashes have rocked Tripoli following the killing of a prominent militia leader, continuing into a second night. The violence, which has drawn international concern, is raising fears of further instability in Libya's already divided capital. What we've seen could potentially allow for Prime Minister Abdulhamid al-Dabeiba's forces to consolidate power. Here to unpack the implications of these developments, we're joined by non-resident senior fellow in the Brookings Institution's Center for Middle East Policy, Stephanie Williams. Stephanie was a U.S. diplomat for 24 years, with service as Deputy Chief of Mission in Iraq and as head of the U.S. Embassy in Libya. With the UN, she brokered the October 2020 nationwide ceasefire agreement and mediated a political agreement which, in 2021, produced Libya's first unified government in 7 years. In addition to writing for the Brookings Institution, Stephanie is the author of a new book published by Hearst titled Libya Since Gaddafi, Chaos, and the Search for Peace. Stephanie, it's wonderful to have you on the program today. Can you walk us through the build-up to this week's events, the major parties involved, and where we stand as of now, May 16th?
Sure thing. So before I walk you through the week's events, I need to explain a term that I'm going to use when describing the militias. I call them hybrid armed groups because you need to understand that these are entities that receive salaries and subsidies from the Libyan state and may enjoy official arrest, surveillance, and detention authorities. But at the same time, they are engaged in illegal rent-seeking activities such as smuggling of migrants, fuel, drugs, extortion of Libyan officials, and ordinary citizens. In other words, these guys are double dippers. So immediately, what caused this week's very tragic, set of events and violence is that there were tensions had been building for some time between one of the Tripoli hybrid armed groups, the so-called Stability Support Apparatus, which is also known commonly as Ghanewa, after the guy who founded the group, who's now deceased, Abdul Ghani el-Kikli. He had accrued quite a lot of power. He sort of ran his protection racket in a neighborhood called Abu Salim, which is one of the largest neighborhoods in Tripoli. But he had really begun preying and predating upon institutions such as the National Audit Bureau and more recently the Libyan telecom, parastatal Libyan telecom entity. So tensions had been building, and he was increasingly at odds with the UN-recognized government. So there was a call for a meeting between him and some of his guys and elements loyal to the government. Well, something went terribly awry in the meeting. There was a firefight. He and some of his loyalists were killed. Then this Brigade 444, which is affiliated with the government and is a Turkish-trained brigade, entered into Abu Salim and sort of appropriated, the facilities that the SSA had previously held. So the government could have stopped there, right? But there was, I think, some hubris and overconfidence. And then they decided, let's go after another major armed group. This one called the Strategic Defense Forces. And this is headed by a much more prominent individual, a Salafi warlord named Abdul Rauf Qada, who, in this group, controls the airport and the city's largest prison. So initially, it seemed like maybe Kara was going to give up some of his facilities, but then the worm turned about 24 hours later, and that's when all hell broke out in downtown Tripoli with the use of heavy artillery, drones, indiscriminate, fighting and use of force. And it just was a horrible scene, and it extended even to the western edges of the capital. After a night of really intense fighting, a truce was struck sort of midday Wednesday, which it seems is holding. The exact number of civilian casualties is not known. The UN has reported that they have verified at least eight civilian casualties. I think that number, certainly among the wounded, is going to increase as medical personnel are able to access areas affected.
Thank you for that scene setter, Stephanie. I'm wondering if you could explain a bit more broadly the political and governmental situation in Libya. As I understand, there are essentially two sort of rival governments in the country. And could you discuss the implications of the fighting, what it means for political stability in the short term, and perhaps in doing so, you might touch upon the ousting of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 and the trajectory it set the country on?
Well, to start with the present, I do think it's a little bit too early to sort of, get the get the looking glass on and predict what's going to happen, whether Dbeibeh is going to survive this or not. A lot of people in the capital partially hold him at least partially responsible for this eruption in violence. But going back to the ouster of Gaddafi, that was sort of part and parcel of the Arab Spring uprisings. Tunisia, Egypt, of course, Syria, the terrible civil war, and the ongoing conflict in Yemen. Libya was exceptional because it was the one conflict in which sort of the UN Security Council, it passed a resolution, which is very disputed, about authorizing the NATO intervention. Was that just to sort of stop the regime from committing atrocities, or was it regime change? Well, it turned into the latter. And so Libya, after maybe a year of sort of calm, and they even had elections, soon things started to unravel, particularly in eastern Libya, where extremists took over broad swaths of that area. You saw killings of lots of people, revenge killings. And then, of course, you had the killing of the American ambassador in 2012 with some other U.S. officials. And then you had general fragmentation, a civil war in 2014, a political agreement that held briefly, but you have this sort of dystopian cycle of war, truce, ceasefire, political agreement, war, truce, and then you move on to whatever the next set of events is. But the fragmentation is serious, and a lot of it has to do with it's a struggle over access to power and resources, and Libyans have not agreed. They don't have a constitution, and they have not agreed how to divide up the resources. And so Tripoli sort of becomes the focus of competition. And that's why you have this eruption of violence, and then you have now basically institutions which utterly and totally lack legitimacy. And so people want elections. Whether Libya can safely get to elections is a good question. There's a lot of work that has to be done to bring people together to have a common understanding about what kind of country they want.
Does what's happening in Libya and the broader general stability or instability in Libya have any ramifications on the region more generally?
Yes, indeed. Well, I mean, Libya is in a prime geostrategic location. So if Libya is unstable as it is, it has a direct impact on, Africa, on the states to the south of Libya, which have seen tremendous instability and coups. Of course, Libya is the center of this horrible traffic in migrants, trafficking people up through the Mediterranean, which puts pressure on southern Europe. And then because it is a major, oil producer, has a small population, it's a ripe target for kind of regional and international actors. The Russians are present in Libya, mostly in eastern Libya, with their ally, the warlord in eastern Libya, General Haftar. And the Turks have really implanted themselves in western Libya. So, yes, it is. What happens in Libya doesn't stay in Libya, and it has also been a cradle for transnational terrorism.
In the Middle East, President Trump's surprise announcement in Saudi Arabia this week about lifting sanctions on Syria has created confusion within his own administration. U.S. officials are still working through the complex process of unwinding decades of sanctions and are demanding conditions for serious cooperation on regional security issues. To discuss the bilateral and geopolitical implications, we're joined by David Lesch, Ewing Halsell Distinguished Professor of History in the Department of History at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. David, thanks for joining us today. This week, we've seen some significant developments between the United States and Syria, potential normalization of relations between the two, and potentially also the lifting of sanctions. Can you walk us through what happened this week between the United States and Syria, how we got here, and maybe within that contextualize this latest development?
Well, it's classic Trumpism, for better or worse. This transactional deal-making paradigm under which he operates in terms of foreign policy, which can be both good and bad. Apparently, there were many in the White House and in the security establishment and in Congress that were caught off guard by the announcement of the lifting of the intended lifting of sanctions. And it shows how influential foreign leaders are with President Trump, because he even admitted that President Erdogan of Turkey and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia were instrumental and critical in changing his mind regarding Syria. I mean, there had been some movement in the Trump administration and in the previous month or so in terms of relaxing their attitude toward Syria, but this was a quantum leap in that regard. Now, having said that, saying you're going to lift sanctions and actually doing it can be two very different things, because Syria was on there's a complex web of international sanctions on Syria from the United States, EU, UN, going back to 1979 when Syria was on the original list of states by the State Department of states that sponsor terrorism. And then you had the 2004 Syrian Accountability Act, which emerged from U.S. accusations that Syria was helping insurgents in Iraq following the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. Then the slew of individual and institutional sanctions placed on Syria during the civil war, all capped off with the congressionally mandated 2019 Caesar Act, which was a sweeping set of sanctions against Syria that had wide bipartisan support. So to untangle all of that and to get institutional and congressional support to reverse these things could take a couple of years. What's going to happen in the interim probably is simply the Trump administration will issue executive waivers waiving enforcement of existing sanctions, and that's important too. It sends a different message in terms of the perception of Syria that perhaps now it is open for business. None of the sanctions, the U.S. sanctions, can be untangled unless the president leads the way in changing the orientation of U.S.-Syrian relations. But it's going to take a little bit. Already the Syrian pound has increased in value just with the news. Gasoline in Syria, prices of gasoline has gone down, and some contracts are being negotiated between some Gulf states and the Syrian government already. So in that regard, it's a sea change. But in terms of really making a difference for the average life of a Syrian, it's going to take some time.
Now, just recently, we saw the fall or ousting of the Assad family and the Assad regime, which governed the country for decades. What was the immediate aftermath of the fall of the regime, and what impact has it had both regionally and on Syrians?
Yeah, it was a moment of great hope for many Syrians. Many people, including myself, were surprised at the speed with which the Assad regime fell. It was in trouble. There were signs that things were not very good. 90% of the country under the poverty line. The economy had shrunk to 85% to what it was prior to the uprising and civil war in 2011. It had been turned into a narco state, militarized by militias all over the country, and people, continuing to suffer while an elite few benefited from what little was being generated in terms of economic wealth in Syria. So, that it fell was not a surprise. The rapidity with which it fell, it's just no one was willing to fight for this, to keep this type of system in place, which is the bottom line. And certainly not even the military, whose wages were paltry, living in terrible conditions. They're not going to fight to keep the Assad regime in power. So there was a sea change in terms of hope for the future. It reminds me a little bit, and I'm not equating HTS entirely with the Taliban in Afghanistan, but when the Taliban came to power after over a decade of Soviet occupation and civil war in the mid-90s, even though people didn't really like the Taliban all that much, they were very, very extreme Sunni jihadists, and some would claim the HTS group that came to power in Syria, is at least elements of it are somewhat similar. But people are just weary. People are just tired, and anybody that can add some little bit of stability, that can feed the people, that can keep the electricity on and the water to flow, and anybody that can do that, we'll welcome them. We don't care what their ideology is. So I sense a lot of that, and they've given this new group, I think, a long learning curve. The new president, Ahmed Shara, who had led HTS for some time, and of course HTS originally was an al-Qaeda-linked group in Syria, has been saying and doing many of the right things in terms of, wanting a non-sectarian, inclusive type of government. In practice, he's fallen a bit short of that. There have been some episodes of violence with minority communities, the Alawites in early March, most spectacularly, the Druze recently south of Damascus, which tends to cast doubt on the ability of the new government to stabilize itself and to unite the country. This is a big step, the lifting of sanctions, because none of this is going to happen for this new government in Syria unless they are able to enact economic reform and get the economy to start growing again, because unless they have salaries to pay the soldiers, they're not going to reintegrate all of these militias existing across the country into a national military. Unless the people start seeing some level of growth, that the grace period that they've granted this new government will start to wear thin. So there's still, despite the lifting of sanctions, there's still a lot of work to do, because there's so much destruction. As I said earlier, 90% of the country under the poverty line, so much reconstruction to do, and all of this is going to take some time. But, this is nothing, none of that could happen for this new government unless U.S. sanctions were lifted. So they were willing to go to make a number of concessions and go a great distance to try to get the sanctions lifted. Ahmed Shara, again, the new president of Syria, had been working with President Erdogan of Turkey, obviously communicating. He had traveled to Saudi Arabia recently with MBS, the Crown Prince. So I think they've been lobbying for this for some time, and that, without this, Syria could devolve back into civil war, instability, and we have, the Syrian Civil War 2.0 all over again with all the negative ramifications.
Well, Dr. Lesch, thank you so much. For a Western or perhaps North American audience, is there anything about the situation or the region that you think might be important for them to understand as the situation continues to unfold?
Well, I think we're seeing a sea change in the strategic paradigm in the Middle East, combined with other things that are going on. In particular, Iranian influence has been greatly diminished, not only because of whatever you think of Israel's onslaught against Hamas. Hamas was an Iranian client, so when Iranian clients are diminished, so is Iran. Similarly with Israel's actions against Hezbollah in Lebanon, as well as continuing actions against even before Assad fell against Iranian and Hezbollah elements in Syria, which weakened their presence there, which hampered their ability to come to Assad's aid when HDS started its offensive to topple the regime in December. In fact, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu even claimed some credit for the removal of Assad. And of course, Assad had been one of Iran's strongest allies and a conduit for Iranian influence into Lebanon for Hezbollah. So this has been a real sea change. And together with Trump's trip to the Gulf and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, extending as well as Turkey, extending their influence in Syria, Iran has been really given a black eye, as well as Russian influence has been diminished. So, is this a new era of potential additions to the Abraham Accords and an overall Arab-Israeli peace? What happens to the Palestinians in all this, because they really lost a lot of their leverage? And what happens to Iran? Will they accept this and play along, or will they lash out against what is a deleterious situation from their perspective?
In South Asia, India and Pakistan announced a ceasefire this week, ending days of intense conflict between the nuclear-armed neighbors. Despite differing accounts of the negotiations, both sides confirmed that diplomacy, with involvement from the United States, helped secure the truce, marking a temporary halt to their most severe fighting in decades. Joining us once again to discuss the truce is Sumit Ganguly, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. This weekend, we saw more development in the ongoing heightening of tensions between India and Pakistan. I'm wondering if you can walk us through the events of this past weekend, which was quite eventful. What kind of escalations we saw, and perhaps you can comment on how we arrived at what appears to be a ceasefire and how durable you think it is.
Over the course of the past week, there were substantial developments in the subcontinent in terms of India and Pakistan. More specifically, Indian aircraft, jet aircraft, made a number of forays into Pakistan and released a series of missiles directed at what India deems to be terrorist camps and also major Pakistani military bases. The question that remains is how effective were these strikes? Obviously, India is claiming that they managed to kill a series of terrorists located within Pakistan and has even released a number of names. But these claims need to be independently corroborated. By the same token, Pakistan launched swarms of drones against India and struck a number of villages along the international border and the disputed border in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which is referred to as the line of control. But most of the casualties that India took were civilians, except for a handful of administrators in border states and one or two paramilitary personnel. On the other hand, there is fairly good corroboration now that the Pakistanis managed to shoot down 5 Indian aircraft which were carrying out sorties into Pakistan, and including a Rafale aircraft and very possibly a Mirage 2000. This opens up an important question about Pakistan's air capabilities and its utilization of highly advanced Chinese aircraft, which it has acquired from the PRC over the past several years. The Indian Air Force is claiming that while there were combat losses, as are inevitable in any war, all pilots returned home safely, which suggests that they managed to bail out over Indian territory. But again, independent corroboration is necessary and is still in abeyance. As far as the ceasefire is concerned, there are again conflicting accounts. Pakistan suggests that by reaching out to the United States, and it successfully managed to get American intervention, and President Trump had claimed that he threatened to cut off trade to both countries, which led them to come to their senses and thereby produced a ceasefire. However, President Trump's propensity for making extravagant claims in the absence of independent confirmation, it is hard to affirm that that was indeed the case. All we do know for a fact is that Secretary of State Rubio spoke to his Indian and Pakistani counterparts, and that may have had a salutary effect. So, in a nutshell, this is what transpired last week, and as far as we know, it came about.
Thank you, Dr. Ganguly. I'm wondering if we can discuss some of the wider geopolitical ramifications for a moment. So as you kind of pointed out there, over the weekend, we saw President Trump tweet about the India-Pakistan cease agreement, and that they'd agreed to immediate ceasefire, and that it was brokered by the United States. On the other hand, China called for a fair and just investigation into the Kashmir attack and seemed to have criticized India's military strike a little bit. I'm wondering how India feels about potential U.S. mediation in the conflict, how Pakistan feels about China's involvement, and maybe you could also present the wider stakes for some of these adjacent actors like the U.S. And China within this conflict. As we know, they're in a great power rivalry, some might call.
The Pakistanis are obviously delighted at Chinese support. They refer to the relationship with China as an all-weather relationship, and Chinese public support for Pakistan, and calling for an independent investigation, which is not about to happen because it's going to be exceedingly difficult to find an independent investigator. And furthermore, India does not want foreigners poking around in highly sensitive areas, because it might also reveal that there was a colossal intelligence failure on India's part. India is profoundly allergic to any notion of third-party intervention to resolve the Kashmir dispute, and while Indo-U.S. relations have dramatically improved in the last 2 decades, I would be hard-pressed to see how any government, especially this highly nationalist government, would allow the United States to play the role of an honest broker. And furthermore, to be quite blunt about it, I don't know that given the denuded state of the U.S. State Department following the cuts that the Department of Government Efficiency brought about under Elon Musk, that there is even spare capacity to devote to the resolution of this conflict, especially at a time when Secretary Rubio is at least notionally wearing 4 different hats.
And that's all for now, but there will be another edition of the Geopolitical Update every Friday. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. This podcast was researched by our research assistants Claire Parsons and Gabriella Picton. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.